Here we go. And here we are.
I have nothing to contribute today.
Oh, it's pop culture monologue hour.
Yep. Everyone, just let me introduce you to my friend Steve.
Hello, everybody.
Steve's got the things today. Take it away, Steve.
We have the things.
And they are all in Steve's corner.
Oh my goodness. This is an unexpected curveball, and I don't like it.
I didn't actually see the movie.
Oh, plot twist.
So I'm going to make this up as we go. Is that cool?
Okay. I'm not going to say it's not
to
cool.
Me like it was a movie that lasted a time. And at the end of it, there were credits.
Movie reviews by Perd Hapley.
Yeah. And in the credits, it said who was in it. And those people are called the cast. And then
they receive credit for their contributions. I'm Perd
That's
Hapley.
why they're called credits.
Oh, man.
It'll cost you 10,000 credits. 10,000? We could buy our own ship for that. Who's going to fly it, kid? You? Yeah, you know what? I'm not such a bad pilot myself.
And now we're presenting Christian Gonzalez's one-man show presentation of the entire Star Wars Skywalker saga. Buckle up for the next 12 hours. I just picture Michael Scott doing that like improv class, the rehearsal, or the whatchamacallit, the thing where he's trying to get a role and he does Law and Order. Like it's a one-man show. Boom, boom, dum, da, 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 boom, boom.
What did he just whisper in your ear?
Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah. Oh, he's got
see your face. I saw your face in person just this past weekend.
Yeah, just like 48 hours ago.
Mm-hmm. Not the Eddie Murphy movie from the 1980s.
Not quite 48 hours ago. A little bit more than that. 72 hours ago.
Yeah.
At least.
We were in North Carolina.
We went to there and did a thing
for
the first time since March 2020. And that thing that we did together was called a beach retreat. The first of which of 2021. Well, not quite. The first one we've done together.
You heard? Yeah. We were in Syracuse, or we were supposed to be in Syracuse together in September, but then that like changed a little bit. So this North Carolina Winston-Salem beach retreat at Annunciation in Winston-Salem was the first time we've been on the road together since March of 2020. A long time ago.
On the road again.
Mm-hmm. And we are actually on the road again because we're going to be in Denver in a few weeks.
No, St. Louis.
I thought it was Denver.
Denver's not till December.
Oh, okay. St. Louis. Okay. St. Louis.
St. Louis.
See you in St. Louis. More barbecue.
Oh my.
I have to say this about the wonderful people in North Carolina. We ate probably better than we have at any beach retreat we've ever done.
I explained to my children that we ate octopus and they didn't know what to do with that. They were freaked out by that.
They've never had octopus.
And I have to admit, their emotional response to that was not dissimilar to my own when I saw the tentacles and the suction cups and there was a little part of me that felt like, all right. I mean, I've had octopus before, but every time that I have something like octopus, I feel like there is a little bit of a mental hurdle because to me, those things feel like you were once alive. Like when it comes to like a hamburger, it's like, it's hard to imagine a cow, right? It's just like, oh, it's just a hamburger. But when you see the octopus and its tentacles, it's like you were a thing.
And I can see the shape of you.
Yes,
as Ed Sheeran recently sang.
Yeah. It'd be like eating a hand is kind of what it feels like. Like, oh, here, eat this hand. And I'm like, I don't really want to do that. It feels mean.
See, I've been octopus hunting in the Mediterranean, actually, octopus fishing, a trip that I took to Cyprus back in the day.
Oh my!
So I had the very uncomfortable situation of like capturing an octopus, bludgeoning it to death, and then enjoying it on the grills like 30 minutes later.
So you beat an octopus to death?
My godfather did, actually. I was very young and squeamish.
Did they know this when they sent you to seminary?
It's a violation of the canons.
Didn't did they know this when they sent you though? You know who I think you should possibly ordain someday? This octopus killer.
this brute. This brute on two legs.
He beat an octopus to death.
I mean,
grief.
There's a mechanism by which the octopus, between the octopus being like a fun little octopus in the water and the octopus being grilled on your plate.
Yes, there's definitely a margin between those two things.
Violence begets violence, which actually is going to be very on topic for what we're going to be talking about today.
Indeed. So what else did we do, though? What else is going on in our world besides eating octopi?
Well, while we were in North Carolina, it deserves to be said, we met the bassist for one of our favorite bands, which was a lot of fun.
Yes, we did. The often imitated but never duplicated Father Christopher Foley of Luxury, which was so cool. It was just cool because like we did an episode on them and their album and the documentary about them. And it's an album, Trophies, their latest album is one that I return to often. Mm-hmm. And it was just cool to like sit with one of the guys and just be like, sometimes I have to comfort myself by telling myself, don't feel bad if you don't feel better right away. And he's like, I get it. So it was like,
his response was like, I'm pretty sure I've said that in confession before. It's okay.
Yeah. It's weird hearing that come out of my mouth. Don't feel bad if you don't feel better right away. Yep.
Yeah. That was a very like weird little fanboy moment that we both had.
It was very much that. Hi.
Big fans.
Very big fans.
And then I listened to Trophies actually on the flight home. So
did you?
I did.
I listened to no music and instead spent 8 hours in hesychistic prayer. It's fine.
Okay.
And then when I got home, I needed to go pick something up on the other side of my pool and just walked across it.
Well done. So when one walks across water, do the soles of one's feet become wet? Or is it just a complete sort of repulsion of the water? How does that work?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And it's something that I get asked a lot. So the best way that I like to think about it is kind of like an oil and water situation. So there definitely is like a separation, but there is kind of like they also sort of somehow kind of participate in one another, but without like confusion or mingling. So there is, does that make any sense?
It's got weirdly Chalcedonian for a second there.
And that's another thing too. It's Chalcedonian. So a lot of people ask me about that as well.
I don't like any part of this conversation.
So what else? What else is going on?
In the bigger picture, church here in the United States, we put a video out about this last week. The Assembly of Bishops recently created 2 new pan-Orthodox ministry agencies. Which is going to be, these like organizations that are going to be leading ministry, not just for a particular jurisdiction, but for all jurisdiction with the blessing of all the bishops. The first one, which is ready to launch, actually, November 9th, they're going to be having a launch party. So you go to their website, Orthodox Volunteer Corps. I think that's all one word, orthodoxvolunteercorps.org. They're kind of like a gap year program, a service opportunity for young adults. They're going to be launching in Pittsburgh. They're going to have a place where young adults can live together, pray together, learn together, serve together, a really immersive community to kind of like figure themselves out. Sounds really exciting. And then there's going to be this new youth and young adult ministry agency, which is still kind of in the process of being developed. The video that we put out was just clips of the bishops like sharing their hopes about not duplicating efforts anymore and having kind of a common vision and a common voice across all of our jurisdictions and giving kind of ministry and young people the united witness that we sort of need here in the United States, in which we've been lacking. So that is pretty cool. That is exciting. That is something that we'll see how it kind of develops in the course of the months ahead, because OVC is like I said, November 9th, they're ready to launch. They're ready to go. The Youth and Young Adult Ministry Agency is still sort of in the process of development, but pray for it because I think that could be really, really transformative for the church.
Totally. It seems like stuff that we've, hoped for a long time. too, kind of coming into reality of like, oh, look, people feel the same way that we do, and feel like maybe we don't have to reinvent the wheel and just call this the Antiochian wheel, and this the Greek wheel, and this the OCA wheel. Like
this wheel says Terz. This wheel says Torts.
Yeah.
It's the only difference.
And this one says church.
Y'all.
Then there's the southern whatever. The southern Greeks, the northern Greeks, the western Greeks. So that'll be good. It'll be good. So excited.
That's it. That's our news. Anything else?
I fear sharks.
Okay. Let's put a pin in that until we do a Pop Culture Coffee Hour episode on Shark Week.
Exposure therapy. First step is facing your fears, Christian. Watch a week of sharks.
Chum in your pockets.
Right. No. I actually really only fear sharks like in a water-based situation. You know, like I'm not terribly afraid of them like in a land type scenario.
Yeah.
You know, like walking down the path in my neighborhood for example, like I'm not too worried about sharks then. But like when I go to the ocean, then I get a little bit worried about them.
Yeah. Well, just as Forrest Gump observed to Lieutenant Dan, they ain't got no legs. That's easy.
Yeah. Exactly. So should I not be afraid of Lieutenant Dan in a land-based situation?
No, I feel like Lieutenant Dan is feisty.
He is feisty.
Until he made peace with God.
Plucky, you might even say.
You might. That's the first word that I would use to describe Lieutenant
Good
Dan.
old plucky Lieutenant Dan.
Ridiculous.
Well, shall we get to it?
What are we getting to this week, Christian?
We are getting to I liked that moment, by the way, in the middle of toward the end of the movie when they recreated him shooting down the sewer. That was really fun.
Yes.
That was like, oh, he did the thing that he does in all the things.
Huzzah!
That was like good fan service rather than stupid fan service.
It was.
So anyway, we are going to talk about the new James Bond movie entitled No Time to Die.
That's right. So this was supposed to be in the theaters back in 2020, but then, a funny thing happened and it didn't release until a couple of weeks ago. So it is very new. It is very much out there. So if you are not familiar with the film, we're going to go ahead and do as we always do and warn you that spoilers are coming. So Christian, if you would, please unleash the porg of spoilers.
Let the porgs rejoice.
There it is. Okay. Now we're in spoiler territory.
Sound of porgs celebrating the destruction of their foes.
The last film in the Daniel Craig series of James Bond films.
Definitively the last film.
Yes.
Unless we go full NBC Heroes series and decide that this movie is not called No Time to Die, but No One Ever Dies.
No. That's bad. We're not doing that.
Bring him back.
Yeah. That's one of the things I liked about this, by the way, that they actually were willing to do that to the character, because Bond at the very end, again, spoilers, James Bond does die at the end of this movie, which
so it
was
turns
really
out
satisfying.
Plenty of time to die.
Yes. Yeah. And it was really satisfying. And we'll get into that later. But okay. So we are in the final, I think the fifth of the Daniel Craig James Bond films, right?
Uh-huh.
And all of this really comes together. I think one of the cool things about the Daniel Craig run is that there actually is kind of an overarching plot that takes us from movie to movie. Whereas the other adventures are just kind of like campy, like here's a thing that's happening that doesn't really have a thing to do with the other larger universe. Like there's a story that is being untold and like a character that is being unfolded, which is pretty great. And the movie opens with Bond in a relationship with this woman, Madeline. He has issues in terms of his trust. which harkens back to the woman that he had a relationship with in the first movie. He fears that she betrayed him, and that becomes kind of a thing that develops later on. But we fast forward, Bond is alone in the Caribbean somewhere, I think. He's retired, but he gets looped back into espionage because there is this thing called Project Heracles, which turns out to be this like DNA targeting super weapon that Spectre steals from an off the books British lab. So the CIA brings Bond in to try to track this down. It turns out that somebody else hijacks the weapon to kill Spectre, and that there's this new villain that ends up coming in who's just trying to like kill the world for inexplicable reasons. That is a thin point in the movie. And Bond has to like defeat this, save this woman Madeline, who it turns out that his feelings for her kind of like develop again. And in the midst of this, he gets infected with Project Heracles. Madeline is the one that he would kill if he has like contact with her, and he accepts his death rather than put her in a position of danger. And as the island that is making this is destroyed, he is destroyed, and thus endeth the chapter of James Bond.
But not 007, because there's already another 007 in the thing. Do you think that we're going to see James Bond ever again?
That is a really good question. Because other movie franchises have just been sort of like rebooting and playing with new stories. So maybe we just get kind of a reboot and a new series of James Bond stories. Because like even in the books, right? Like I used to read the books when I was a kid. Like 007 is just sort of the designation, right? Like you're the most elite agents are the 00s, and there's 9 of them. So it makes sense that somebody else would like get that 00 designation, but she is definitely not James Bond. I don't know that she's going to figure prominently in the future, that it becomes less of a Bond series, but we'll see. I don't know. But what did you think about the No Time to Die?
I give it 2 solid mez. I mean, what I mean is this. I mean, it was a Bond film, right? And so that's a lot of fun. And Daniel Craig, of course, is incredible. It doesn't get much in terms of like Bonds in the Bond universe or whatever, multiverse. I don't even know anymore. It doesn't get much better than Daniel Craig. You know, I mean, he's up there with Connery, right? Yeah. But I thought the plot was, at several points, was nearly incomprehensible. And of course, it might have been because I didn't see the last one. Like somehow that one slipped through my radar. So I don't know that I really understood exactly what Spectre was, or what the threat they presented was, and then like why I cared that they were dying or anything like that. The best that I could understand about why Rami Malek's character wanted to kill the bad guy, the Spectre guys, is because a member of Spectre killed his family. That was the farthest I got.
Yeah.
But even that didn't totally make super sense to me in terms of how we went from point A to point, killed everybody in the world. So, but yeah, and then there was just a couple points too. I was like, I didn't really understand what was going on in the Poison Garden. I saw it with a couple of buddies, and we were laughing about it, cracking up. But like, what was going on? Like, what are all those people doing in those weird pink plastic suits or latex suits? Are they growing the robots? Like, what are they growing in this weird poison water? And why do people dissolve instantly when they fall into it? And what are those weird rave lights that are, everywhere? So we couldn't quite figure out some of the things, like what exactly they were farming. We didn't know. We couldn't figure. Were they growing DNA? We don't know. It's all just very confusing, because it seemed like Project Heracles was a little different than just the poison. I don't know. It didn't make tons of sense to me. So anyway, other than that, it was fun. Overall, I thought I gave a really nice end to Daniel Craig's arc. It definitely made his 5 movies stand out amongst the rest of the James Bond movies, for sure. We'll talk about that too, how he just moved beyond some of like the normal Bond tropes and into, stuff a little bit more exciting. But what did you think about it?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this movie. And I say this as like a fanboy who has watched, I think, all of the James Bond films over the years. I used to read the Ian Fleming novels when I was a kid. For a while, like I've had this kind of like tension in my head, because I have this strong love of Sean Connery as the original quintessential James Bond, but I really appreciate the way Daniel Craig has reinvented the role and actually kind of went back to some of the things that made James Bond interesting at the beginning, because, like if you watch the Connery movies, there's a lot more like one-on-one sort of physical violence, and you really get a sense for the cost of the violence and the brutality of it. Whereas later on, it gets a little bit gadgety and a little bit sort of like explosion in the background. Like you don't feel the human toll of what it is to take life.
It's just Pierce Brosnan like gunning down 30 Russians at once. Like,
with no remorse or anything.
Huh?
As opposed to like, and you can tell if you remember the first movie, right? Casino Royale that Bond does. There's that moment at the beginning, spoilers on that if you haven't watched Casino Royale, where
I think it's out of the statute.
I think so.
That was like 99.
Yeah, true. He kills his first person, like in the initial scene, which is what gives him the ability to like be designated a 00 agent. And he has that conversation with the bad guy about how the first kill is the hardest, but then it kind of breaks something within you, and then it becomes easier to kill. And you kind of see that moment where he really wrestles with the fact that he's taking life, and then he still kind of wrestles with it. And you have those like very intense, like you see the eyes of the person that he's killing. Like you never escape the brutality of it, which I appreciate here. But you also add this other dimension of like family and love and the emotional sort of healing that actually happens with Bond and the Daniel Craig sort of thing. I agree that the plot, I think, pivoted a bit quickly. Even having seen Spectre, like the fact that this new guy comes in, I think his motivations weren't terribly fleshed out. I think that some of the aesthetic choices were probably to evoke kind of like classic Bond villains.
Oh,
and their, like,
for sure.
Volcano layers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, presumably they're not growing nanobots in this like shallow pool of water with, LED stick lights or whatever it is. So that felt fast, and I don't know if that's like an editing issue that they just kind of cut the movie too aggressively or what, but I don't know. That's definitely an issue. It's not like a fantastic movie, but I do think I agree that it was a nice resolution to this character arc of James Bond. And honestly, they gave him the ending that I think a character like that deserves. I don't remember if we ever talked about like the Christopher Nolan like Batman series, for example. But I'm still upset that they didn't kill Batman at the end of that series. Like Batman got to escape and not actually like pay this price for Gotham, whereas Bond actually, like, as part of his redemption arc, right? Like he actually is willing to give his life for somebody as opposed to simply take the life of others. So it was fun. It was fun and it was good. And there's like, I think, stuff to chew on here.
Yeah. And I definitely would want to echo that, they really did cut that 2 hour and 45 minute movie very aggressively. 2 hours and 45 minutes. Very aggressive.
Totally.
Wait, are you serious? It felt so long to me. I was like, oh my gosh.
Well, so this
some
is
of
one
it
of those
in the middle,
things.
I'm like, oh, come on.
Well, maybe miscut then, because
that's true. That definitely I would agree with.
Right, because the motivation of this character is not terribly clear, and so forth. So
yeah, it's so fun. It was I had such a weird experience watching this movie, and I don't know why, but anyway, we can do another podcast about that called Pop Culture Experiences Coffee Hour. Like, let's talk about not pop culture itself, but our experience of pop culture.
Pop culture meta hour.
Pop culture hour. So you touched base on this, and I think this is probably the most important thing that we need to look at throughout this whole thing, right? Is just that this really is, for Bond, really a story of redemption.
Yeah.
And the progress that you begin to see from the first of Daniel Craig's movies to the last of them, where one of my buddies pointed out actually that this was one of the only, maybe the only Bond movie to not have like a Bond girl kind of in like the classic sense, or like any weird sex scene kind of in the middle, right? Which is really, I think, just about as anything, even as much as like that opening action sequence in Bond movies is as much a trope of the Bond films as anything else, right? Yeah. Like it's just like, well, and then he meets like, the like glamour model, and then they end up in bed together at some point, and everyone feels a little uncomfortable because it's like, how often does this happen for this dude? Like, it seems like there's like, every time you meet someone, they're in bed together. Yeah. But this took the movie or the franchise a really different direction. He was in an actual relationship and actually loved a person, and even when he puts her on the train and sends her off, like, he doesn't go shack up with anybody else. Like, there's no, and even in the one moment where you kind of think he's gonna, right, when he meets that girl in Cuba.
Yeah.
right? And it's for sure like the most just like, provocative moment in the movie. He's going to change into his tuxedo and he asks her to turn around. I was like, oh, this is so interesting.
Yes.
That he's like, can I have a little bit of privacy? Which is not something that Bond is ever worried about. But it's
Yeah.
almost like there's something where he's given his heart and his body to one final person, and like they're just Madeline's, and they're not anybody else's anymore. So I thought that was like such an interesting thing.
Yeah,
Because
totally.
I can't think of any other like Bond movie where something like that has happened, with the possible exception of in Her Majesty's Secret Service, but where he gets married. Remember that? Did you ever see that one?
Yeah, that's the
Um,
Dalton one, right?
no, that's the Lazenby one.
Oh, that's the one that's not technically canon. It's just this like thing that like just kind of is part of there. But I think there's, yeah, I don't know if it's canon or not officially.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I do remember
Yeah.
that being kind of in its own deuterocanonical kind of thing, apocryphal. Um, it's like the Maccabees of the Bond.
And the oil lamps burned for 8 days to celebrate the wedding. Yeah.
Or at least Bell. It's at least Bell and the Dragon, for sure.
But I have to say something about that, right? Yeah, like the ambiguity of Her Majesty's Secret Service, right? Whether Lazenby actually is a Bond in the full canonical sense of the word. So like I used to read the Ian Fleming novels when I was a kid. So like Ian Fleming he wrote these James Bond novels. That is what eventually became the movies, right? The original, I think actually Casino Royale was the first one, as I recall.
Yeah,
It's
first book, yeah.
Yeah. And you get the backstory on James Bond. And there actually is this is since high school now. So I'm kind of searching my memory banks here. There was a love interest or a wife or somebody that is killed very early on in the process. And James Bond's womanizing, I think, can be sort of interpreted as a very base way that he fills the void of this person. Like he actually had this woman that was meaningful to him and that he wanted to give his life to. She, I think, Spectre kills her, as I recall, something along those lines. And
even in the movie, she dies while they're driving down a mountain from their wedding. Like she's killed like right after their marriage or something like that,
Yeah. Which again, like to make that sting sort of really feel right, because this whole sort of like conversation about like the redemption of Bond, like there's a lot of wounds, right? That the Daniel Craig portrayal is very upfront about, like the loss of love. I mean, in this context, it's like the loss of Vesper. So if you remember from like the Casino Royale movie, there's the woman that he thought betrayed him. It turned out she didn't. She was trying to save him. And he still he confesses his love to her in this movie at the tomb at the very beginning, right? He's still haunted by that loss, and then haunted by this double loss of rejecting Madeline, even though this is another woman that he's come to love. So it's like the way that brutality wears on his soul, the way that loss wears on his soul, the way that the loss of like the character of M, right, who was played by Judi Dench in the original couple of movies, like this mother figure that he loses.
Is that what I remember?
She dies in Skyfall. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Like Bond is a character that is shaped by wounds and loss. And that creates a rough edge around a person. Like the loss of his woman is what causes him to like become a womanizer, right? The loss of this mother figure leads to like just kind of general distrust, which I think kind of also shapes the way that he can't have these relationships with these women. He just like he's got real trust issues. But you see the way that kind of like comes together, and Bond has an opportunity to, if not heal, at the very least, like have a way to be redeemed from all of these wounds and struggles and falls and shortcomings.
Right. And I think that what's so interesting, kind of the way that, at least through the way that this movie kind of plays with stuff, and really the whole Craig narrative arc, again, with the exception of that, as far as I know, of Spectre, because I didn't see it. Yeah. It really plays with this kind of like this movement out of a trope and into being kind of like a actual person, right? Like he's not just some dude that like, goes around drinking martinis. I mean, he does drink a lot of martinis. He at one point he even comments on that. He's like, it's been like 3 hours since I had a drink. And, do you remember that moment?
An alcohol problem, yeah.
But even that's more to your point, right? Like there's like something that. And I remember thinking at one point too, like when he walks into the Spectre party and he like has a drink real quick, I'm like, dude, you're on the job. Like you can't be drinking right now. Like, what are you doing? You're going to be all dulled to your senses and goofy about stuff, making weird jokes. And everyone's going to be like, Who invited this guy? Anyway, um, so what is interesting to me about this though is that I think we often relate to other people as tropes of themselves, right? Like, oh, classic. I mean, even think about people like classic Steve or classic whatever, or classic. Da, 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 da. I mean, you could do that all over the place with like classic Bond, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
starting with an action scene, classic Bond. Which I mean, they did do that. They didn't throw that out the window. Classic Bond hooking up with some Bond girl. Classic Bond with his nifty gadgets and classic. You just kind of get into this thing where you kind of think that you begin to know what to expect from someone. And I think that like what a redemptive narrative arc suggests is that things aren't just one way forever, right? Like people change and people develop, and we move out of those tropes and we start being different, which I think is something that's hard for people to swallow, right? Is that people change. I mean, you even see this in systems like when people go away to college, right? They grow up and they come back to their family system, and they feel like, oh my gosh, like am I still like 16 here, or like why am I going back into this weird way of being of relating to mom and dad? And part of it is like, well, because mom and dad relate to me the way that they knew me when I left, right? They haven't been there for the whole journey. They haven't been along with me on this kind of movement through different stages of life, or questions that I'm asking about my faith, or whatever it might be, right? And so we just kind of get stuck on stuff. And I mean, to some extent, I think you see that in the larger culture with like cancel culture, right? We kind of like think we should punish people for something that they did years and years and years ago, instead of thinking maybe it's possible that Kevin Hart doesn't think that way anymore.
Yeah.
He shouldn't be allowed to host the Oscars because of a thing that he said when he was being thoughtless, and when that was like a normal thing that people said. And I don't know. It's like that's what's, not that it makes it okay, but to be like, oh, you obviously are a bad person.
Yeah, I think there's this tension that, the cancel culture thing I think is interesting as well. Like that it's the tension between like accountability and moral progress, right? That I mean, Lord knows, right? I am very grateful that I did not have a Twitter account when I was 15 years old, because,
oh my Lord,
right? Like, I mean, I know what a dummy I was at that age. Like, I'm kind of glad that there is no record of the dummy that I was at that age. That makes it easier for me to kind of move beyond that and to like be an adult and kind of think differently and think more maturely and so forth. So yes, be accountable, right? If you did or said a hurtful thing to somebody, there's got to be some level of accountability. But what does that mean decades later? What does that mean when you still are that person clearly, but you've also grown since then, right? That's a nuanced conversation that we're not willing to have. And I like that connection to this whole thing of tropes, right? Because a trope is fundamentally born of a lack of nuance. A trope is fundamentally born of our ability to try to, in two dimensions, kind of define somebody. Like you were saying, like that's the guy, right? Like it's not a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional person who's also evolving through time, right? It's just kind of this very thin stereotype. And you can see where tropes come from, right? Like tropes, I think, kind of like they what happen when character becomes taken for granted, or character becomes like made thin. Because like a trope comes from like, that's the way that Steve tends to operate. That's the way that Christian tends to operate. That's the way that Bond tends to operate, right? Like as I know him, I can have a sense of like what is going to be expected. But when those expectations begin to dominate your view of that person and not allow for any room for growth, right? Like that's when people become characters, right? Like stereotypes in a thin sense of the word. And we're no longer curious about the person, and we're no longer giving a person the opportunity to grow and develop. It's just like, that's who you are, as if we can define the essence of who you are in a catchphrase.
It's funny, like I'm remembering now too, like one of the first times that I had this kind of weird like understanding of like trope being kind of like that, what you're talking about, this kind of 2-dimensionality, and even having it like kind of put on me in some way. When I first started working in ministry and like doing the church stuff over a decade ago, at this point now, it's like I remember having this conversation with a priest in Southern California, and I had like long hair and like I wore sandals everywhere and short. Like, I mean, this is what I'm wearing right now is like, this is just me. Like I'd happily dress this way all of the time if I could, like I don't know. Like I wish that I could go into like my private practice dressed like this and be like, hey, what's up, guys? Like, let's talk. Like it's fine. I actually think shoes are small prisons that were invented to like make us submit to tyranny, like be comfortable with submitting to tyranny. They've conditioned us to expect to be prisoned. Also, pants are the same way. So
shoes and pants were created by the Illuminati. Confirmed.
100. I really firmly believe that there's got to be some sort of shoe pant conspiracy. I would get on board with that. I would if like as a non-conspiracy theorist, this is a conspiracy that I'm. Yeah, no, there's some. Definitely, there's some.
There's a Bond villain stroking this white cat. It's like, next we will have them wear pants and things upon their pants for their feet. Let us call them shoes.
And then we will put laces on them so that they get used to being in bondage, like to having cords tied around their appendages. No, it's definitely a thing.
Come and see the violence inherent in the system.
Yeah. Help. I'm being repressed. Help. You saw him, didn't you? So anyway, I remember with my sandals, shorts, backwards hat, long hair, probably unkempt beard, talking with this priest and just like sharing some of the things I was thinking about and the questions I was asking about ministry, kind of in my own work. And he just was like, he just looked at me like he was totally shocked. He was just like, he was just kind of like, look at you. I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, well, you've got like this long hair and sandal. Like you look like this dude who's just like, meh, whatever, kind of floating through life. And he's like, but your brain is like always going, isn't it? And I was like, yeah. And he just like never would have expected that from me because I just don't present that way, because I like wearing sandals. And it's just interesting that those are the kinds of tropes that we can put on people, right? That we think that like, oh, they fit these particular kinds of things, right? Like we expect them to act a particular way. But if we can't be open to like the complexity, like the people are complex, that there's far more than we could ever imagine, then we miss out on really encountering anyone who's other than us, or other than, and even other than our expectations, which is just another part of us too. Our expectations are us.
Yeah, 100%.
We should open a store called Expectations Are Us.
What would we sell?
Disappointment.
Oh, I have a stitch in my side.
This is what your dad wanted you to be.
We got some layers to unpack here.
It's like Jesus washed my tongue, but right before he finished, he finally told my dad, he's good enough.
We'll add a footnote to the Free Guy podcast from a couple of weeks ago.
That line remains one of my favorite lines in any movie that I've ever seen.
It's very good. It's delivered like very well.
Washed my tongue.
This whole conversation gets to something we've talked about before. Essence and energies, right? Which we sometimes talk about the church, right? And the kind of like the inherent mystery that is at the core of every being, right? And the church will say this, right? Every being. It's not just that like God in his essence is unknowable. Like we are all sort of in our essence unknowable as well. Like there's sort of a reverential awe to these things, and unknowability makes us uncomfortable. And I think that's one of the reasons why we kind of deal in shortcuts, right? Like on a cognitive point of view, it can be a helpful shortcut, right? Like to be able to summarize a person or a thing. But I think that, to bring in another kind of theological concept, this is where we have that tension between the apophatic and the cataphatic. Like it is helpful to say that like, oh, Bond is the womanizer who drinks martinis and kills people, right? Like I get what you're trying to say, but if that's all Bond is, that also becomes problematic. And this is where we have to have that tension between like what we can say about a person, about a thing, about God, right? If we're to be sort of strictly theological here, and all the things that we can't say, that there's still a level of unknowing that is held in tension with this knowing. And that's where freedom lives. And that's where mystery happens.
Do you feel like it's kind of back to this, like, that question of like the like confusing like part for the whole, right? Like that we
Yeah.
kind of get stuck into this like persona, rather than being a person.
I think, yeah, maybe I wouldn't express it as part for the whole, but like we get confused with qualities and essence, right? Like we confuse the things about a person with the person. Maybe that's another way of playing with that like persona language in person.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think
you
it's
know,
like that's parts. Like it's part of me is,
yeah,
like part of Bond is certainly a womanizer,
yeah,
right?
100%.
But to say that he is that
Yeah,
is like that's where we get into some of the danger, right? When we totalize a person based on a part of them.
yeah, especially a broken part of them, right?
Yeah.
This I think actually becomes like a really interesting thing, a tension that we have in the church, right? That um like when Christ goes and talks to the prostitutes and talks to the tax collectors and so forth, like the people in the larger community will like essentialize those people, right? That is a prostitute, that is a tax collector, that is a person that you should have no dealings with, as opposed to like Christ's continued like this is a person who is making a mistake or has a particular wound or whatever it is at this particular stage of life, and I'm there to heal this person, as opposed to like that's all they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the ways that we essentialize things, unfortunately, in our world is like a broken thing about you, right? Like this actually kind of came up in the retreat this past weekend as some of the stuff that we were talking about with like the teens there, the discomfort sometimes with sharing things in a community because the broken parts of you can be turned into shorthands and tropes that like define the entirety of you, right? I'm the kid that, drank at a party one time. I'm the kid that did drugs. I'm the kid that whatever, which is like a thing about you and a thing that you did, but it doesn't define you. And we sort of like have a problem when we allow those like sins in particular and shortcomings and wounds to be the thing that defines ourselves in each other's eyes, as opposed to a wound that needs to be healed.
Thinking about the word broken right now.
Yeah.
And I wonder about it because like I guess maybe I would be curious as to kind of like how you define something as broken.
Mm. How to define something as broken?
Yeah. And like how the impact of sin or whatever maybe kind of like breaks a thing.
Yeah.
Because when I hear the word broken, it like it's I can't help but carry a certain amount of like a gut feeling of just like shame with it. Rather, and I think in my feeling, and in like what I have wondered about is like really the interplay between shame and accountability, right?
Yeah.
Like because I feel like if I'm just broken, then I actually can't really truly take accountability for anything wrong that I've done. I'm just broken. It's like a clock that doesn't work, right? Like, well, I don't work. I'm broken.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas if I do work and there's kind of this other part of me that maybe is, I think this is why I like the word disordered maybe better, like, or confused or extreme or something, right? Because like the Pharisees are good guys. The Pharisees were good guys. They did really good things.
Sure.
They got confused about who the captain of the ship was, though, once they started letting their goodness and their need to be good and their need to be right kind of run the show. Right? There's nothing wrong with being right. There's nothing wrong with being good. It's just that like that's a ship whose crew is out of order. Does that make sense? Like, no, there needs to be like one captain, and then like the part of you that is right or cares about being right, that wants to be right, that wants to know the truth, that wants to do the good thing, that wants to whatever. That's good when it's in its proper place. But when you put it in the captain's chair, then it's going to be willing to do things like commit murder when somebody's caught in adultery.
Yeah.
Because we can't have, we got to get rid of the impurity. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly we've moved from being the kind of people who like want to do things that are good and be right and be true to being the kind of people who are willing to commit murder for the sake of maintaining purity. Like there's a, does that make any sense? And I don't know that I would say that the Pharisees were broken as much as like they needed to be rearranged.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make any sense? It's like putting the wrong furniture in the wrong place.
It does. It does, and I think this is again one of those, like, this is an example of that apophatic sort of cataphatic tension that
Yeah.
words can reveal something helpful, but when words cannot define a thing in its totality. Like, I think that the helpfulness, in my opinion, that comes with a word like brokenness is that it's got a connection with like healedness, right? A thing is broken. My arm is broken. It needs to be ministered to. It needs to be healed, right? Rearrangedness or sort of disorder is, again, a different sort of word, right? I mean, you see that especially in like philosophy. Plato will talk about the soul being disordered and so forth, right? And the antidote to that is sort of rearranging. And they're both right. I mean, they both kind of like tack on what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the question is, what is the kind of language and word that actually like leads to some level of inspiration and repentance versus what is the kind of word that leads to a feeling of demoralization and trappedness and shame,
Yeah.
right? And different words are going to maybe resonate with different people, but the underlying concept is like a thing is out of whack and a thing needs to be healed.
Yeah.
Right. Or put back in place.
I think, and maybe that's why I'm just realizing I've really loved the word restored lately.
Yeah.
You know, like the idea of restoration, because the underlying structure of the thing is what we're going for. You know, it's like we want to kind of like find something in this that needs to be recovered or uncovered or anything like that, as opposed to like there was something kind of wrong with the original. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so I like that. I like the restoration project kind of being, you know, maybe that's like, maybe like I like that idea of like God's salvation being a restoration project.
Yeah. You know? Right. I mean, like that's definitely like, and this is, I think, where ministry is more art than science, right? Because as we're speaking to people and we're helping them like organize their thoughts and experiences and make sense of themselves and, you know, try to like reveal Christ to them in a particular moment, there's no like abstract rule book, and words that might have worked in one context won't in another. Right. I mean, like this, to use kind of a silly example, like this is the reason we don't just like read the sermons of the fathers in church on Sunday, even if they were commenting upon the same exact like scripture readings. We need to craft words that are going to speak to the people in our care. And, you know, if I'm having a pastoral experience with you and the word healing and brokenness is not doing it for you, like those are words that I shouldn't use, because the point is to minister to you, not to feel fidelity to the particular form. Right.
Right. Which I don't think is to say, by the way, you know, and I think that even like the bond stuff gets into this, that there aren't things like consequences that can't be undone. Right. Like, you know, once he has the robots in him, he has them in him forever. Like there's no way around that. Right. And like you kind of touched on that in our outline, but like I think it's the difference between like accountability and shame, right? Like the accountability says like, yeah, I did this thing and yeah, whatever. And I need to own up to it and I need to fess up to that. But shame kind of in this larger framework is going to be the thing that keeps us stuck in these tropes, both in our own thinking and what we put on other people, right? Like, well, you're just that kind of person. You're an adulterer. You're you're a this thing. And it's like, well, I guess I'm a that thing.
And that's all you are.
Yeah. Yeah. And that to me seems to be like, well, did you commit adultery? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Like, okay, yeah, you did that. So, but there's more to it than that. And like, yeah, there's probably going to be some consequences that come along with that. But let's maybe explore what that was about. You know, like, well, I was lonely. Well, I needed some protection. Well, I needed to, you know, connect somewhere. So it's like, okay, well, maybe we can see if there's some other way of dealing with that, right? Some other way of meeting it. And then we can just see, instead of just feeling like super ashamed and falling into a hole somewhere in the middle of the earth, like maybe there's a way to, I don't know, see what's driving the bus. Like, don't let that part drive the bus anymore. Yeah. Because it gets you almost stoned, lady.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Bad news.
Yeah, you definitely do not want that. Yeah. And I think like, that, and I think then the challenge, right, to because you're kind of like pulling it back to the movie here. I think one of the interesting challenges in terms of like that redemption arc is, what does that redemption look like with different people? So, you know, the thought that I had about the redemption arc of Bond, who goes from like this person who had experienced love at some point, did not live a life with anybody else, right? Distrust put him away, like his work, killing people for a living, sort of pushed him away. But then he gets to this point where he reconnects with Madeline. You have that sweet scene that you identified in the outline too earlier, where he's cutting the apples for Madeline's daughter, right? Which turns out to be his daughter as well. Sweet. Like she lies Papa about Bond. It, right? But like that's his child. And he's being a dad, and you never, like, when do you see that by like a James Bond ever? But like it's interesting to me to kind of like you play with that, but I don't know, like, would he actually have been able to navigate the transition completely from, international assassin, spy extraordinaire,
man of mystery,
to guy who like has a 9-to-5 or is just like a stay-at-home dad? Like, I don't know, like that, and that's why I think the like
what's Bond doing now? Tables. What's his job? Tables. See for reference. I think you should leave.
That's the title of the show, not a statement about you, dear listener.
No, stay here. Don't go anywhere.
But I wonder, like, could he have actually like lived out a lifetime of repentance, or is the repentance and the redemption that he was capable of at that point like the choice to die?
Yeah. And is that enough? Right? Like, is that good enough?
I wonder, I mean, like in like as what the church would say, right? Like the thing that comes up to me is the thief on the cross.
Yeah.
Like if you think about the thief on the cross, right, who is the first person that Christ like brings into the kingdom, is there a single thing in his life that he did that was good or virtuous? Like, no, as far as we can tell, right? I mean, there's pious traditions about him being a thief, and he, like, I don't know if you ever heard this tradition when Mary and Joseph and Jesus were going to Egypt, like he like was going to rob them, but he spared them or something. Like there's kind of pious traditions around like what's a virtuous thing that he did at some point. Like where is a way that he showed love?
Yeah. I've heard this. Yeah.
Right. But all we really know is like he's on the cross and he just has this moment where he confesses Christ. He spent a lifetime killing and stealing and whatever it is. And like that's enough, right? Like he dies well. He doesn't live well, but he dies well. And that becomes the onion, to use that sort of Brothers Karamazov sort of like thing that Christ uses to pull him out of his like woundedness and out of damnation. And like, maybe that's all that Bond was capable. He couldn't live well because he was so disordered or so untrusting or so scarred by killing who knows how many people. Like maybe that's the best possible outcome. Right. I don't know.
I think sometimes we kind of like, I wonder, I guess I should say, not I necessarily think this, but I do wonder like if sometimes we have to kind of retcon those kinds of stories to, because we have a hard time imagining that God is more merciful than we are. Like, oh, well, we have to find something that God would have saved him for, instead of like God just wanting to save this dude because he made him. Like like at the end of the day, maybe that's kind of what this is all about, is like, has nothing to do with the thief's goodness, but everything to do with God's goodness. And I do wonder about that too, right? Like even with Bond, and for all of us, right? Like if we really consider salvation as this kind of movement toward God, and I don't just mean like, kind of like the cheesy Hallmark card stuff that we kind of maybe do of like, I was walking and I saw two sets of footprints, and then I looked back and saw there was one, and I was like, where were you, God? And he was like, well, that's when you were too weak and I had to carry you. And like I don't believe that. I don't believe that way, I don't think. But what I do believe is that we, are these participants in Christ, that we are in Christ and Christ in us, and that the path is to embody that life more and more. Right. To, as Jesus says, repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. Again, we talked about this before, like change the way you think differently. It's not when you get there, it's like, see that it's now, open your eyes, think differently. The kingdom of God is here. It's come. It is in our midst. This is what we confess every Sunday when we say Christ is in our midst. And when we say, blessed is the kingdom of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And like any time that we're like walking, in sync with the Spirit of God, like that's us living in the kingdom that is here, but maybe not always something that's in our mind, right? So I wonder about this, like, the metania, like the seeing differently, the thinking differently. Like Bond himself, even though he remains some level of murderer, whatever, all the bad stuff that he does. I mean, he killed a ton of people in this movie, just a bunch of them. And
plus four others.
Huh?
Plus four others. I mean, not just this movie, right? Like if you think of his career.
Plus 24 others, right? Like,
well, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, over 24 movies. I really wonder if anyone's ever gone through and been like, I'm sure on the internet somewhere, of like how many people exactly has James Bond killed?
Mercy.
But what happens is this love for this woman, Madeline, has moved him to a place where he has kind of been able to cease from his womanizing.
Yeah.
And instead put on a virtue of fidelity. Yeah, it took a while to get there, but isn't that deification?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, in some real sense, right? Isn't he being deified? Isn't he becoming like God, who is himself the faithful one? Who tells Hosea to go marry a prostitute because he wants Hosea to get like a little flavor of like what it's like to be him vis-a-vis Israel. I mean, this is one of the big things of like, and even in the gospel or the epistle reading from this last Sunday, right? Or not Sunday, sorry. Dang it. When was I at church? Monday evening for St. Demetrius. The epistle reading was like, and even when we are faithless, he remains faithful because Christ cannot deny himself. Yeah. Right? And so to have Christ in us, he remains faithful to himself in us. Like he can't, send us away. And so if like the whole thing is to like, I don't know, become more and more like God, it seems to me like he would rejoice wherever that comes from and however that shows up.
Yeah.
Making any sense.
Yeah. But the question is our response too, right? Like that. And I think that I wonder if God in his mercy, like to clarify, because I think this is like a helpful conversation. If like, I wonder if like, if that's kind of a sign of God's providence, right? If like the thing that Bond was most capable of in that moment was dying well, I wonder if that becomes like God's providence in that moment. Like, who knows? Like, would he have been able to actually been like a faithful husband for the rest of his life? Would he have actually been able to like be a dad? Would he have actually been able to do of that? I don't know. And that's why I wonder if like, here's the thing you can do, right? You're a person who like deals in brutality and you're a person who deals in death. Like in this moment, you're not going to kill, but you're going to give your life and you're going to like release, this woman that you love, and you're going to sort of wish her well. And you're going to be this memory of courage and selflessness for her. And that's going to be the best for them. And that's going to be the best for you in this moment. Like instead of a lifetime of struggle, I wonder if that becomes like in God's providence, like the gift that he gives Bond in that moment, right? Like it's fiction, obviously, but I'm trying to sense like, is that the best he could do? And that's the gift that God gives him. Like, I don't know if you'd be able to like live a lifetime in this way, but I think you could die really well.
Right. And the only reason he could, right, was because this fidelity had already been growing in him.
Totally.
Like he'd had this kind of movement toward Christ, who for him, Madeline was Christ, right? Like the thing that brought him out of his former way of being. And instead like grew in him this kind of godlikeness of faithfulness, even though it's like Bond's version of faithfulness, which still involves killing plenty of bad guys. But I just wonder about that. Like, is God's mercy that big? Like that he kind of takes whatever we can give,
Totally.
Whatever it is and wherever it comes from.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like everything that we know about God, I think the answer to that is yes, right? Because he loves the righteous and he shows mercy to sinners, right? Like he desires the salvation of all. And that's what I think is so powerful. And that's why I use that like onion language, right?
Right.
For those who don't know the story, right? It's a beautiful story, right? It's for those who have read the Brothers Karamazov, or at least have like heard the story. There's this beautiful kind of like folk Russian tale that Dostoevsky tells, where there is a wealthy widow, I think it is, right? Like a beggar comes to her table, to her door, asking for food. She doesn't want to give him any, so she takes like the moldiest, squishiest, softest onion that she can find in the back of her pantry, and she chucks it at his head and chases him away. And then she dies and she finds herself in the lake of fire. She finds herself like in torment, and she's crying out to her guardian angel for like some level of mercy. her guardian angel goes to the Lord, comes back, and he's like, well, God remembers that you gave this beggar an onion. Gave this beggar an onion, not
Right,
chucked
yeah.
a moldy onion at his head, right? And on
Very
account
generous.
of that, yeah, totally, right. And on account of that, like, he's willing to grant you passage into paradise. And he lowers this onion to her, and she grabs it, and he begins pulling her up out of this lake of fire. And everybody around her begins to then grab onto her legs because they see her being pulled out of this fire. And the angel is pulling her higher. More and more people are grabbing onto her. She has this anxiety that the onion is going to break, that it's not going to be strong enough. And yet, as many people as grab onto her, like, the onion doesn't break. And it just seems that it has the ability to carry more and more, potentially all of these people out of the kingdom of, out of the lake of fire. And the onion only breaks when she shakes off all of these people and kicks the last person off, right? That's when the onion snaps, when she's the only one that's holding on to it. God in his mercy, like, used this incredibly brutal, demeaning thing to be unto her salvation. And not only her salvation, but like the salvation of everybody, until she kicked everybody off. I don't know. I've been thinking about that, like, just in terms of life, right? Like the things that don't go well necessarily in the past, this weird sort of like difficult situation that is like put in front of us, right? Maybe this becomes a way that we find God's providence in this moment. Like, how do I be a Christian in this moment? How do I, even if I couldn't live as a Christian, right? As James Bond maybe had struggled with, like, how do I die as a Christian in this moment? Even if I couldn't be a friend to this person because a relationship breaks down, how can I be a friend, in the midst of this pain? How do I be a Christian in this moment? And that becomes like an onion, right? Like, maybe it's not the ideal.
It's like the question of maybe we can't always change circumstances, but we can certainly have a different experience of the same circumstances, right?
Yeah.
Like, either by acknowledging, like, again, Christ in another person, or Christ with us, or kind of whatever, framework we want to put on that. Like, so much of what I think causes us so much trouble in our circumstances is that we feel like we're going through them kind of like existentially alone, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're as if we're the only ones in it. But kind of like, even, and you even said there too, and thinking about the onion, like, that is the problem, is when she goes through it alone. That's what ultimately breaks the onion, is that it's her by herself on the onion.
Yeah.
Whereas if she was able to have a different experience of the circumstances of the onion, then everyone could have been pulled up with her. And I wonder about that. Like, there's that kind of like gravity that comes with being this person of, who's in Christ. Like, I think about the martyrs and like the way that they die, that, I mean, it's in their death that they convert many. Christ, the Roman centurion, it's not until Christ is dead on the cross that the world finally recognizes him for who he is, right? It's truly, this man was the Son of God. Like, there's something about death is just death. However, the way that it goes about, our experience of the circumstances are the same, right? Pantaleon's head still gets chopped off. Yeah. But the way in which it happens is like life-bearing, it's not just about dying. It's about being born into new life. And Bond, I think in this one, kind of, it's hard to tell, right? Is there like this acceptance and kind of like, steadfastness and faithfulness to Madeline that empowers it? Or is it like the typical Bond kind of stoicism, right? Like, greeting nothing terribly passionately, but just kind of like, whatever happens. But I think you're right that it is kind of this like last bit that, changes everything for him, is his love for Madeline, in which he's able to kind of like embrace death as a way to kind of like keep her, because he's probably knows, like, I don't think I could be with her and not touch her.
Yeah.
I can't do that. I need to be near her.
What sort of torture would that be for both of them? Oh, right. Like, does this actually become the best possible outcome?
Yeah. Cause now she can go meet someone else and find someone to raise her daughter with her. And
Right. And that's why I thought it was so beautiful that the last scene of the movie is Madeline driving around with Matilda, right? That adorable little child in the back
She
seat.
is so dang cute. Oh my gosh. There was a couple times looking at her, I was just like, oh no. Because like, of course I'm seeing this as a dad of 3 daughters going like, oh, she lost her popo. What did she call it? Poo poo, pow pow. I forget what she called her little bunny.
Doo-doo or something, yeah.
And then he picks it up at the end. I was like, oh, he's being such a good daddy, finding her lammy. That's one of my daughters loses her lammy all the time.
Oh.
And whenever he's gone, we say that Lammy went on an adventure. Oh, he's just out having an adventure.
See, isn't that appropriate? You're constantly finding the lost sheep.
Yeah. Just like Jesus.
Uh-huh.
That is how I was saved.
and that's the thing, right? Like Bond, who is now this person, like, what is his story, right? Because they're driving around and Madeline says, I want to tell you the story about a man that I know, the man who's your father, right? And his story is no longer a story of pain and isolation and lack of trust and betrayal and paranoia and, and
looking
lost
over his shoulder like he is at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah. His story is like, this is the man who loved us enough that he was willing to lay down his life for us. This is the man who, even though he never knew you, when he fell in love with you the first moment that he saw you and made you breakfast that one day, and you told him it wasn't bad, which was really cute.
That was really cute.
How is it? Not bad.
So funny.
Just refreshingly honest, like kid, like, okay, I've had better.
Totally. Yeah, no, it's true. It's interesting, but by that act, right? He sort of, as Dumbledore would probably have it, kind of becomes the master of death, right? Like up till then, he had used it as a way to achieve an ends, right? Killing people, to kind of get through things. But in this way, it becomes a way of protecting and loving, like, and it's his own death ultimately that leads to it, and not killing somebody else. I mean, he does kill plenty of people.
Yeah. But that's not his last act, right? His last act is accepting death voluntarily as opposed to inflicting it on anybody else.
Yeah.
And maybe that's worth exploring. Yeah. Or escaping it. Right. And maybe that's worth like reflecting on for kind of our last sort of little bit here, because I think this becomes like one of the interesting points of the plot. That's what, like, what, as we discover, right, there's this Project Heracles, which initially we think is like this specter thing that the bad guys have been creating. But it turns out that it was the good guys, if I can use that language, that were the ones who were besides this genetically targeted, like perfect tool. And M, right, Mallory, the new M that we've had for a couple of films now, he says that we did this to eliminate collateral damage. We did this as a way to, like focus on the people that we were like trying to take down and kill. But if he's using violence to try to solve a problem, and all that happens is that a new problem ends up getting created, because he never conceived of it as a weapon of mass destruction. He conceived of it as this like targeted thing to take out terrorists and pass harmlessly through people. Whereas Remy Malek's character is like, what if I change the DNA sequencing and I have it like take out an entire ethnicity of people or an entire like race of people or whatever it is, right? Suddenly it becomes genocidal in this like brutally efficient way. And violence continues to like breed more violence, and violence, which is supposed to be like pushing back, actually has this equal and opposite reaction. And there's just constantly more bloodshed and constantly more loss. And, the only way that you break that cycle is like you said before, like you submit to this as opposed to shooting at it.
Yeah. No, that's one of the things that's like it's really interesting. I think that we, I've had conversations with other like Christian people, and there's like kind of a take on sometimes like violence really being this kind of like unfortunate but necessary way of dealing with like a fallen world and stuff like that. And that remains a really hard pill for me to swallow. Like the idea that like, well, you need like people out there with like guns to, bring down the bad guys. Like, who's going to bring down the bad guys? And I think like sometimes there's unfortunately some reality where that probably like when you need to do that, I guess, like to stop Hitler, like someone needed to stop Hitler. However, there's also ways that the United States could have stopped Hitler without going to war, but we don't have to talk about that just yet. But Um, the but I think about like Bonhoeffer, right, who kind of as an act of individual responsibility, that's how he talks about it, as responsibility, even though he's a pacifist, decides that he's going to engage in this plot to kill Hitler, through the bomb right under the table that didn't work, because he
Yeah.
weighs kind of the two tensions of like, well, I mean, as a pacifist, I don't know how you blow somebody up, but like you try if you have a good reason for it, if you have like a response, like, why did I do this, even though I am a pacifist? It's like, well, because, and he said this, he's like, I really believe that those who live by the sword die by the sword. I believe that is like, when the Lord said that, he meant that. And I also know that I'm supposed to protect the people that I need to protect, like the widows and the orphans and the defenseless and all of this kind of stuff. And he's like, the reality is of this dude, like, no one else is going to stop him because they're all bought into like his garbage. So I'm going to participate in kind of the plot to bring him down, knowing full well that to live by the sword is to die by the sword. So he kind of like accepts just that, like, I know what this means. Like, this is still an act of evil.
Yeah.
But it's one that I'm willing to do, knowing that the punishment is coming my way, because it's going to protect the most amount of people possible. To him, it was not that even that it was justified, right? It was not about justification. It was about responsibility.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to take accountability for this evil act. And like, this was the only path forward that I saw, but I still think it was evil.
Yeah.
Which to me is like, dude, like, that is the act of faith, right? And being like, look, God, I know I did this evil thing, instead of needing to justify myself to God.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
here's what, so
But that really strikes me as being consistent with the witness of the church. And I'm certainly not a specialist on this or anything, but like, my understanding is that like, even in the Byzantine Empire back in the day, that that when war happened, and war sometimes, if I can use the word, needed to happen, right, because people were invading or whatever it is, like, people would take up their arms, but there was always a sense that like a penance would have to be offered when they returned, because to maybe rephrase this, right, like, it might have been the best choice under the circumstances, but it was still, in the grand scheme of things, a bad, broken, wounded, evil choice. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, anytime we are in a position to have to like kill each other, something is not going right. And it can never be sort of like explained away in terms of justice or whatever it is. It was explained as like responsibility, right, to the people who would otherwise die if the invaders actually were able to like enter the city, right? Because the women and the children and the innocents would be like slaughtered. And so like, what do we have to do? Like, I've got to slaughter them before they slaughter these people. And then when I come back, like, there's some sort of penance that has to be paid, because I'm going to be changed. Right. I mean, like, this, I think the other,
for sure,
like, this is the other way I think that, and I've never experienced warfare or anything like that, so I have no like firsthand experience of this, but talking to friends of mine who have, have been in war and served, because they have some sense of responsibility for the safety of their neighbors and so forth. Like, it's a thing that affects the soul, and it's not to be entered into lightly. And, I think even that kind of goes along with some of the stuff we identified about the Daniel Craig portrayal of Bond, that they don't enter into it as lightly and flippantly as maybe some of the other portrayals do, where it's just like explosions in the background, or sort of mowing down and like nameless, white, like on the ski slopes, right? Those like very classic James Bond things when everybody's skiing and they're like white parkas and like shooting machine guns at each other, and Bond is mowing them down. Like, that's not how that happens. To take life is to wound one's own soul, like, paging Voldemort, right? And it's not justified. I mean, in that deep sense of the word, it's like, again, the only way that I can put language to it is like, maybe this is the best choice under the circumstances. Under very limited circumstances.
At least from what I understand, in like Dr. Tim Petitsa's book, The Ethics of Beauty, he does make it very clear, though, that even if it's the best choice, it's still always an evil one.
Yeah.
Like that. And to get away from that language, right, is, I think, to our own detriment, right? And I think it's probably where we start seeing some of the weird kind of militarism that is like invaded, I think, a lot of religious circles, right? Especially Christian religious circles, where like, this idea, like, there's a part of me whenever I see like God supports our troops or God bless our troops or whatever. There's kind of to me of like I'm like, but what about the other guy's troops? You know, like is God not with them? Is he like against them? Or like those are the questions that kind of come to mind for me with all of that kind of stuff, right? Of like, is this something that we really would say? Like, would we say God bless their troops too?
Mm-hmm.
And like, if not, then it seems to me that we've kind of deified our own ranks and like, you know, again, justified their violence as good violence as opposed to like the other guy's violence, which is, you know, a threat to the American way of life and et cetera, as if like they're really the bad guys. We get good guys and bad guys. And that to me is like, are there good guys and bad guys in an evil game? You know, like that. And that to me is like, well, maybe we need to talk less about who's the good guys and who's the bad guys, and just about the fact that this is it's an evil game. And our response to it should be lamentation, no matter what, like for, you know, the loss of any kind of life, for any kind of blood that's shed. I mean, like violence is just, I don't know, man. I don't know how we ever, you know, as Christians who follow a crucified king, it's like, how do we ever feel okay about it? I don't know if that makes any sense.
Or rejoice in it, right? And that's
rejoice in it. Yeah.
And that's the tension, right? That like, okay, maybe this is the thing that I needed to choose in this particular moment, but I'm not happy about it, right? Like I did it, right? Like I think Bonhoeffer becomes this really like example. Like I did it, I chose this. This is the thing that I needed to do, but don't glorify it.
And now we're back to accountability, right? Like if I can at least take accountability for the choices that I've made, the whatever, like there's actually a chance of redemption, right? I've heard this one saying once, and I don't even know where it came from, but I really loved it. It was that God can save the sinner that you are, but not the saint that you pretend to be.
Yeah.
And like, I love that idea, right? Because then we can just be like accountable for, like this is the thing that I did. Yep. That was the choice that I made. Like, I didn't see any other way forward than to try to blow up Hitler, you know? But to at least still admit like, no, I mean, it's tough. I made the best choice I could, and that choice was a bad one, an evil one. So I don't know. That's to me like the crux of accountability. Like, I didn't know what else to do, but I did it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to learn a better way going forward, please.
And that becomes, I wonder if that's one of the messages of the movie, right? Because at the end, like the Project Heracles is done. It's not about like taking the weapon back or anything like that. I mean, it gets wiped out. Like the scientist who made it is wiped out. The plant is wiped out. Like this those
sword.
Nice
workers that were in the pink jumpsuits.
Oh, they're gone. Sorry to break it to you. They're gone.
But they weren't anywhere around. Were they just running for the shoreline?
I mean, they might have. Okay, fine. I'll be agnostic on the question of the of the nameless workers in their hazmat suits.
Just working along in the farm.
The Among Us characters, right? Yeah.
Oh, they definitely were Among Us characters. You nailed it. That's exactly what they are.
What they were all doing was just crossing the wires, like reordering the wires in the water. That's what it was. Swipe this card.
Yeah. One of them was a saboteur. That's really funny. Well, this was an interesting conversation.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I don't know. I feel like we had to do it because this is, you know, the final Daniel Craig movie. This is like a series now that has been in the pop culture imagination for 50 years. Right. I mean, I feel like we've never done a Bond film before. Like it felt like the right time to talk about this thing. And yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of depth here, and there's a lot of beauty. And I'm glad that this franchise has evolved away from some of, like you said, the kind of like the tropes and the stereotypes and that campy, you know, like the Roger Moore, I guess in particular, right? That very like stereotypical, you know, swigging a martini while I'm, you know, blasting a flamethrower across the world, you know, while a buxom woman like holds onto my leg or whatever it is.
It's fun.
It's fun.
Oh, well, Lord. Shall we wrap it up?
Yeah. So what are we going to be doing at the end of our podcast here?
So we have gone with our, idea of God sightings. Like where did we see God at work throughout the last couple of weeks in our own lives? Because we want to learn to see those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Stephen, why don't you start us off?
Yeah. So my God sighting this week was I've had a couple of interesting conversations with friends, you included, over the course of the last week, without being sort of like too detailed about the sort of stuff that I've been talking about, but kind of like interesting questions of sort of like, work and things along those lines, and like trying to figure out where kind of, I don't know, just my own kind of like sense of things. Like, am I being prideful? Am I being stubborn? Whatever it is. And I had, I think, a lot of misgivings and a lot of questions about some things that have been sort of percolating. And there's been something really refreshing about having kind of trusted friends who can look me in the eye and just be honest about things with me, and like affirm and support things that need to be sort of affirmed and supported, but be kind of critical, not in like the tearing down sort of sense of the word, right, but in the corrective sense of the word, to be like, yeah, maybe you're not thinking about this, or maybe you're being motivated by anxiety or fear or pride or whatever it is. Like, I think sometimes for me in the past 2 weeks, I think my kind of like sense of the divine has been a little bit difficult and a little bit challenging, and it's come as in the form of like honesty that has helped me to push myself and to grow and to try to be reflective and honest about some of my own motivations and some of my own kind of like internal sort of boundaries and desires and hopes about some things. And that's the thing, right? Like, encountering God is not always like a kind of comfortable, like the clouds part and you have this moment of peace. Like, sometimes coming face to face with God like pushes you a little bit when the response is like repentance. And I think like this was me in the past couple of weeks. Like, it's been a bit of a push and a bit of a twist and a bit of a contortion and a bit of a purgation by fire rather than anything else.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, that's always fun. When it's like let's take away some of the things a little bit. Let's strip you of the defenses and the kinds of like ways of thinking of it that are maybe not helpful to the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, to be honest, I think that my eyes haven't been terribly open probably a lot of times, because there's been a lot of like just practical questions that I think that I've mostly been like wrestling with throughout the last couple of weeks. Just like different, like, kids, like going to like trying to get kids into schools and, wondering like, what are we going to do for education and all of that? Cause like, my oldest daughter goes into middle school next year, and we're just trying to figure out like, what do we do there? And like, just a whole lot of that different kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that like, one of the things that's been really interesting to me is like, I've been just doing some different reading kind of about like different stuff, and, I'm being purposely vague about it. But part of what I've been reading has been just like really normalizing for, I think, some of the experiences that I've had over the last couple of years. Because I think that I had felt, just with like different stuff happening throughout the last couple of years in the cultural landscape and all this different stuff, I've had a lot of questions and a lot of different kinds of wrestlings. And, this book that I came across has kind of just been like, if you feel like this is happening and like this is part of like progress and development and whatever, I was like, oh, thank God. Like, there's kind of like a thing where it's just been like really like, oh, I'm not crazy, like I feel like, okay, I'm not going totally nuts in my life, right? Like, I am just going through a thing, and that's okay to just go through things and trust that there's a thing on the other side of the thing, So it's interesting because the book itself is really about kind of like doubts and stuff like that. And my doubts have been really interesting because like they haven't been like, do I doubt that there's a God, or do I doubt Jesus Christ, or do I doubt anything like that? The answer to all those questions is no. Like, let's look at the creed. Yeah. I haven't doubted that. Other things kind of ancillary to all those different kinds of things, like there's been plenty of doubts for the last couple of years. But like this book has kind of, I think, given me freedom to kind of like go into those questions and to see doubt not as a problem, but as a pathway, as a doorway into deeper levels of faith, into deeper levels of belief, right? I mean, think about when a kid's like learning how to walk, they might not know how to do that. And they kind of like hesitantly might take those first few steps. But eventually what happens as they develop is they start to walk and they find these new ways of transportation and moving around. And that to me has kind of been more what like doubt has opened to me, is like, are there new ways of seeing this and new ways of learning to navigate the world that can be even more beautiful and faithful than the stages earlier, that I was in. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
It's been liberating is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Because you're never done, right? I mean, life is about constant conversion and reconversion, and, to use that like C.S. Lewis language, it's like further up and further in, right? And and this is stuff that we talk about in effective Christian ministry, for example, that doubt becomes one of the challenges that we have, but those challenges can be baptized into opportunities, right? I mean, like Thomas's doubt became this entryway into his confession for Christ, right? And I think sometimes we can, to use the language that you were using earlier about sort of like the shame, right? We can suppress these doubts rather than like address them, right? And engage with them and deal with them and allow a person to understand, like, why am I asking this question? What is the underlying need that is there? Like, that is a far more secure thing, right? As opposed to like, that's bad, that makes me uncomfortable, stop asking hard questions. Yeah. And honestly, like if we're not comfortable doing that within ourselves, we're not going to be comfortable doing that with like our kids as parents, right? Or the teens in our youth group, or the young adults in our parish, or even the not so young adults in our parish, right? Who have the same thing.
And the wild thing about like trying to silence the doubts is what if there's like if I could ask you anything, then that convinces me that you're not afraid of anything. Right. But if you can't ask me something, then that makes me wonder exactly what you're hiding. Right. Like if I can't ask this question, what are you hiding?
Yeah.
You must know the kind of like the structures behind it are fragile. And I don't know if I want to be a part of something that I can push over with a question, you know? But if it's like, you really believe it's unshakable, then like, let me try.
Yeah. One of the things that we talked about a few times today was like the tensions that we sort of live between, right? The apophatic and the cataphatic, right? And I think that we've become far more comfortable as a people dwelling in not tensions, but binaries.
Totally.
Right? Which are clean, right? Which are these like tropes, right? Because
good or bad, right or wrong.
Yeah. My side, your side. As opposed to the tension of this, like there's only one side at the end of the day. It's not my side. All right. It's not your side, it's God's side. And I'm the one who has to keep like repenting of that and figuring out what that means, as opposed
changing
to
the way that I think, changing the way I see.
Opposing
I need to see differently. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, it was a really helpful read. I'm just like, oh, it's okay. It's going to be okay. It's all going to be okay.
Yeah.
Further up and further in.
Further up and further in.
Know what I mean?
That's it.
That's it.
Do we know what we're doing next week? Or next time? Are we doing Dune next time?
Oh God. I think we are doing the Wes Anderson film.
Okay. We're doing Dune eventually.
We're doing what eventually?
We're doing Dune eventually, right?
Oh, maybe it is Dune.
Maybe it is Dune. Okay.
Let me look. I'm looking.
Okay. Feeling that dead time on the radio. I should like pull a Troy and Albert and have his like hand scrawled like.
So I do have us down for French Dispatch next week or next time, but it doesn't need to necessarily go that way.
Okay.
So
I would like to do that at some point, and we should do Dune at some point. Yeah, yes. Totally.
Cool. Because that's what we have. It's one, and then it's Dune after that. So French Dispatch and Dune are the next two. Order TBD.
Okay. Yes. We shall talk to Dan, because we are going to have a guest on our Dune episode, whenever that is. We got to figure that out.
But we promise that we will talk about Timothée Chalamet. Regardless of what we watch, Timothée Chalamet will be involved in it somehow.
You can take that to the bank.
because COVID makes movies confusing.
Here's the 7 movies this actor is
Everybody's in
this year.
Yeah.
Oscar Isaac is playing
Everyone.
another role.
Yeah. Exactly. That's kind of what it feels like.
Yeah. Well,
Like,
big
these
Hollywood
people had a really busy pandemic, and you realize, oh no, they filmed these like 4 years ago. That's why.
Yeah.
They all look so young.
It's like COVID hasn't broken them yet.
Yeah. So young and full of hope.
Anyway,
Well,
this was fun.
but not really fun.
I enjoyed it. I don't know about you. You're more of a meh.
Yeah, I did too.
But I enjoyed it.
I did too. You made me like it better. All right, fine.
You're welcome, Daniel Craig.
Yeah, the jury was out on you, but we brought them all in, and all verdicts point to meh.
We leave this podcast as we entered, shaken,
Yeah,
not stirred.